If you've ever tried to explain how you feel to someone from a different generation and felt like you were speaking a completely different language, you basically are. And the reason has nothing to do with attitude, or sensitivity, or being too soft, or being too cold. It's psychology. Specifically, it's what happens when two human brains develop in two radically different worlds and then have to share the same room. Today we're going to break down exactly what built each of these generations from the inside out, why they keep crashing into each other, and what the science actually says about how to close that gap. Because neither of them is broken. They just got different blueprints. Here's what happens in almost every Gen X and Gen Z interaction. Gen Z says, "I just need to talk about this." Gen X hears, "I need you to fix this." Gen X responds, "Just push through it. You'll be fine." Gen Z hears, "Your feelings don't matter." Both people walk away thinking the other one is the problem. But here's what the psychology actually shows. Neither of them is wrong. They are both running on two completely different psychological blueprints. And those blueprints were drawn by two completely different worlds. Sociologist Karl Mannheim described this back in 1928. He wrote that people who come of age during the same historical moment develop what he called a formative encounter with the world. Basically, the world you grow up in during your teenage years doesn't just give you memories, it gives you a way of seeing, a lens you carry forever, usually without even knowing it's there. Gen X and Gen Z did not share a formative encounter. They shared a country, sometimes a house, sometimes a dinner table, but not a world. And that distinction changes everything. Let's talk about Gen X first, because their psychology is the one almost nobody explains properly. Gen X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, is called the latchkey generation for a reason that is very literal. In the 1970s and 1980s, the divorce rate in the United States doubled. At the same time, more mothers entered the workforce than any previous generation, which was a genuine social breakthrough. But it also meant something practical and immediate for millions of kids. They came home to empty houses. A key on a string around their neck was the actual symbol of this generation's daily life. Now here's where it gets psychological. When a child repeatedly experiences emotional absence from caregivers, not abuse, not dramatic trauma, just consistent absence, their developing brain makes a very specific adaptation. It learns, my emotional needs will not be met by other people. I need to meet them myself. Psychologist John Bowlby, who spent decades studying how children bond with caregivers, called this attachment theory. And his colleague Mary Ainsworth, through her landmark 1970s research known as the Strange Situation Study, identified a specific pattern she called avoidant attachment. Children who consistently don't receive emotional responses from caregivers learn to stop seeking them, not because they stop needing connection, but because their nervous system learned that asking for it leads nowhere. Why ring a doorbell when nobody's home? This is why Gen X tends to say "I'm fine" and genuinely mean it differently than other generations mean it. For Gen X, "I'm fine" is not denial. It's a statement of identity. I was built to handle this alone. And that is not weakness. That is a completely rational adaptation to a world that gave them no other option. But here's what made Gen X's formative years even heavier. Beyond the empty house, they grew up watching institutions fail repeatedly. Watergate showed them government couldn't be trusted. The AIDS crisis, mismanaged badly by the government through the 1980s, showed them that public health systems wouldn't protect them either. The Cold War sat over their entire childhood like a low-level alarm that never quite switched off. Jean Twenge, professor of psychology at San Diego State University, spent years analyzing data from over 39 million people across national surveys going back nearly a century. In her 2023 book, Generations, she describes Gen X as deeply pragmatic, self-reliant, and quietly skeptical of institutions. Not because they chose cynicism, but because the institutions they grew up with gave them specific, repeated reasons to doubt. By the time Gen X reached adulthood, they had a very clear psychological operating system. Don't wait to be rescued. Don't trust systems to protect you. Handle it. Keep moving. Keep your emotions internal. Now flip the world completely. Gen Z, born roughly between 1997 and 2012, did not grow up alone. They grew up connected. But here's what nobody tells you. Hyperconnection creates its own kind of psychological pressure that is just as intense as isolation, just in the completely opposite direction. First, think about the world Gen Z was handed before they were old enough to process it. 9/11 happened before most of them could talk. They grew up in a culture permanently shaped by it. Security lines, threat levels, the normalization of mass tragedy as background noise. Then came the 2008 financial crash, which many of them watched reshape their families. Then, school shootings became a recurring event in their lives, to the point where active shooter drills became as routine as fire drills. And then, before they could finish growing up, a global pandemic shut everything down completely. This generation did not get a quiet childhood. They got a childhood that told them repeatedly, the world is unsafe, unpredictable, and the adults in charge may not be able to protect you. And then they got a smartphone. Jonathan Haidt, social psychologist at New York University, makes this case in detail in his 2024 book, The Anxious Generation. He identifies a window between 2010 and 2015, when childhood fundamentally shifted from what he calls play-based to phone-based. Before that window, kids still had unstructured time, boredom, low-stakes conflict with friends, the kind of friction that actually builds emotional resilience, without anyone realizing it. After that window, that free time moved inside a screen. And on that screen was something no previous generation encountered at that developmental stage, a constant, real-time record of how other people perceived them. Jean Twenge's research found that after 2012, when smartphones crossed 50% ownership among American teens, rates of adolescent depression and anxiety began to climb at a speed not seen in decades of data. Here's the psychology. The developing brain of a teenager has a core job, figure out who I am, by watching how others respond to me. Psychologists call this social feedback processing, and it's one of the primary functions of the adolescent brain during this period. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson named this stage identity versus role confusion. It's when you're trying to build a self. Gen X built that self in relative privacy, among a small, fixed group of people, with limited audience and limited memory of their mistakes. Gen Z built that self on a public platform, in front of hundreds or thousands of people, with every mistake documented, searchable, and shareable. A 2021 study published in BMC Public Health, analyzing over 13,000 adolescents, found that more screen time was linked to worse mental health, increased behavioral problems, and poorer sleep. But here's what the researchers found most significant. The mechanism wasn't the screen itself. It was the displacement of face-to-face emotional processing. The brain was doing its identity work through screens instead of through real human interaction. So what did Gen Z's nervous system do with all of this? The opposite of Gen X. Where Gen X learned to suppress emotion because nobody was there to receive it, Gen Z learned to amplify emotion. Because in a world where you are competing with infinite noise for anyone's attention, emotional volume becomes the only way to be seen. This is not being dramatic. This This is a rational adaptation to the environment they were handed. Now put them in the same room. Gen Z says, "I've been feeling really anxious, and I need to talk about it." Gen X hears, "I can't cope, and I need you to rescue me." Gen X responds, "Just push through. You'll be fine." Gen Z hears, "Your feelings are a burden." Both of them are wrong about what the other person meant. And both of them are completely right about what they themselves need. A 2025 study from the Journal of Psychosociological Research in Family and Culture examined generational gaps in emotional expression between parents and young people. They identified 5 core areas of miscommunication, and the biggest one they called mismatched support expectations. Younger generations expect emotional presence, someone to sit with the feeling and not immediately try to make it go away. Older generations expect to show up by offering solutions, someone to identify the problem and fix it. Neither of those responses is wrong. But when they collide without either person understanding the other's wiring, Gen Z walks away feeling dismissed. Gen X walks away feeling useless. And both of them stay confused about why they keep having the same conversation and getting nowhere. The most psychologically literate generation in history, sitting across from the most self-reliant generation in history. And they cannot figure out why the conversation keeps breaking. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Gen X and Gen Z have more in common than either of them realizes. Both grew up in worlds that did not adequately protect them. Gen X was left alone physically. Gen Z was left alone emotionally, surrounded by people and devices, but receiving algorithmic responses instead of human ones. Both adapted by building walls. Gen X built walls of silence. Gen Z built walls of performance. And underneath both of those walls is the same question: does anyone actually see me? There's also one more layer to this that almost never gets mentioned. In many households, Gen X didn't just grow up differently from Gen Z. Gen X raised Gen Z. Think about that for a second. A generation that was left alone too much, that learned never to ask for help, that built their entire identity around self-sufficiency, became parents during a period when cultural anxiety about children's safety was at an all-time high. Some Gen X parents swung completely in the opposite direction from their own upbringing and became more protective than any previous generation. Others tried to replicate what they knew. Either way, they were trying to parent a child through a smartphone era that had no historical precedent. Gen X couldn't fully guide Gen Z through that world because Gen X never lived in it. And Gen Z couldn't explain it to Gen X because Gen X didn't have the framework to receive it. They are not enemies. They are 2 generations that survived opposite forms of neglect, and they are now speaking different recovery languages. So what actually closes this gap? The research points to 3 specific things. First, translate before you respond. When Gen Z says, "I need to talk about this," they are not asking for a solution. They are asking for presence. The most effective response a Gen X person can give is simply, "I'm here. I'm listening." That's it. You don't need to fix anything. Your calm presence is the actual intervention. And what helps an overwhelmed nervous system is not advice. It is what psychologist Stephen Porges calls co-regulation, a term he introduced in his 2011 book, The Polyvagal Theory. The idea is simple. Your calm, regulated nervous system helps stabilize theirs. You don't need to say the right thing. You need to stay. Second, name your operating system. When Gen X goes quiet and says, "I'm fine," Gen Z reads that as emotional shutdown or rejection. The bridge here is simple. Gen X, try saying instead, "I'm processing this internally. I'll come back to you when I'm ready." That one sentence translates your wiring into a language Gen Z can actually understand. And Gen Z, when Gen X goes quiet, that is not them pulling away. That is their nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do from childhood. Handle it internally first. Give them space, then check in. Third, and this is the most important one, stop confusing adaptation with personality. Gen X's self-reliance was a survival strategy, not a personality type. Gen Z's emotional expressiveness was a survival strategy, not a personality type. Both of these behaviors made complete sense for the worlds that created them. When you see the behavior as adaptation instead of identity, the judgment drops. You stop thinking they're so closed off or they're so sensitive. You start thinking, they adapted to a world I didn't live in. And this is what that looks like. Generational labels are blunt instruments. Every psychologist will tell you that. Twenge herself is careful to note in Generations that her research describes patterns, not individuals, and that there is enormous variation within any generation. But the patterns are real, and the science behind them is clear. Gen X and Gen Z don't understand each other because they were built by different worlds, not different values. Not different levels of character or resilience or worth. Different environments, different formative encounters, different psychological blueprints that each made perfect sense for the world that drew them. The generation that raised itself alone. The generation that was never alone, but always lonely. They are not as far apart as they think. They just need a new language. And that is what we do here. If you're Gen X and something in this video landed differently than you expected, drop your birth year in the comments. I want to know who's watching. If you're Gen Z and you're sending this to someone in your family, that act alone is a bridge. Subscribe if you want to keep decoding the psychology behind why people are the way they are. Because we're going through all of them.